Hey, Cub fans. Thanks for joining us here today on Cubs 24/7, where Randy talks Cubs. A couple of weeks ago, I was doing some research, one of my profiles, and I came across a guy who created this metric. And the gentleman's name is Greg Huss. You can see Greg. Greg, wave at him for now. That's Greg. So Greg he specializes in Cub prospects. And as I was doing some research, I came across a metric that he had created, and I was intrigued by it. So I actually thought, oh, I want to talk to Greg and find out about this. And then I thought, you know what I'll do? I'll invite him on. So I sent him a note, invited him on. He was gracious enough to do it. So, guys, this is Greg Huss. Greg, I'm going to let you tell everybody about all your contact stuff at the end. I want to get right into the meat. Okay.
Yeah.
So, guys, the metric, it's an acronym, and it's BASH, and it stands for Ballpark Adjusted Standardized Hitting. And the idea is Greg deals with prospects. So in many cases, you've got prospects of different ages at different levels. And Greg has created this system to sort of level the playing field so we can get a better gauge on it. So Greg, go out, take it from there and tell us about Bash, how it started, how it's going.
Yeah, I remind people whenever they're using Bash to not get hung up on what the acronym, like what it actually stands for, because really it was just a way to get to the acronym Bash. So I
Right,
could say somebody was
right.
bashing a certain number. Yeah, so the reason why I created Bash was because after the COVID season, the lost minor league baseball season, there was such a change in the age at which we saw different prospects at different levels.
Right.
We got used to over the course of the previous 10 years or so, a certain guy of a certain age being low A, being at high A, being at double A, being at triple A. And all that was kind of thrown out the window to a certain degree after COVID with the loss of the short season baseball.
Mm.
And then another thing I noticed was that I use WRC plus, weighted runs created plus over at Fangraphs quite a bit to try to figure out what a player looked like offensively, his entire offensive production. But the problem with WRC plus is it did not take into account ballpark metrics. So
Mm.
a ballpark where it's really difficult to hit in, like Myrtle Beach, for the Myrtle Beach Pelicans, super difficult to hit at that level or in that ballpark. And so numbers that we saw with WRC plus, if a guy was hitting 120 WRC plus, which means he's 20% better than the league average. That is true that he's 20% better than the league average, but that doesn't take into account the fact that he's doing it at a ballpark where it's way more difficult to hit in. And so
Right.
I wanted to kind of throw in some ballpark adjustments. I wanted to throw in league wide adjustments. And then the last thing, like I mentioned, was throwing in the adjustments for ages, right? So
Okay.
a guy Bash accounts for the age at which a guy is compared to his competition. So a guy doesn't automatically get bumped up if he's 20 years old, which means he's younger for the system. But if he is 20 years old at double A, he's way younger than the average guy at double A. And so if he's performing well there, it means a whole lot.
Mm.
So
Mm.
those three main adjusters, the age, ballpark, and league, all go into this Bash metric.
Okay, excellent. As I was going through it, I saw you had an analogy about PCA. And with where we are, guys, with PCA right now, everybody's wondering, is PCA going to be able to hit? Go ahead and tell that PCA story.
Yeah, is it just about the what he did this
Yeah,
past year in terms of Bash?
yeah. Then what did PCA bash?
Yeah, so this year in 2023, this past year in 2023, PCA bashed 127, which is like I said, 27% better than average.
Right.
That was one of the best marks in the entire farm system. And what helped that bash for PCA was the fact that he was still just 21 years old
Right.
doing this in the upper levels of the minors, right? He was in
Right.
double A, in triple A,
Yeah.
performing incredibly. Now, actually, in 2022, PCA had an even better bash. He ended up bashing in 2023, in 2022, he bashed 134. So it was even better than he was this past year. And part of that was because he was still younger than league average
Right.
down at the lower levels, down in Myrtle Beach and South Bend, but
Yeah.
he was doing them in ballparks where it was much more difficult to hit in. So
Yeah.
the league wide OPS in AAA is significantly higher than the Carolina League OPS, and so he's been one of the better performers in terms of Bash both seasons in 2022 and 2023 that he spent in the Cubs farm system.
That's awesome. Now, in my mind, just to kind of keep it simple, the Bash PCA did 127. 100 is average. Is that correct? Like with
Yep.
all the plus, the new like OPS plus just takes OPS, which I don't necessarily use that much. I'm still a little old school. I'm very comfortable with OPS, but I just know OPS plus 100 is average, and then you go on up. So what's interesting about it is it's basically to use a golf term, it's a handicap. So
Yep.
we're getting a better read. And see, that makes sense to me. And the reason I was intrigued by it is we're trying to predict, right, with these prospects. They're so young, and we're trying to put a predictable, maybe like an objective, predictable measurement to it. And the old one just didn't do that.
Yeah, and the big thing where that really starts to show itself is in AAA, right? Because AAA, you get a lot of veteran players that have spent a lot of time either in the major leagues or in the minor leagues.
Yeah.
And you get guys that are posting numbers across the board that are really impressive, right?
Right.
And your thinking goes to like, okay, like he's been really impressive in AAA. Like he's also going to be really impressive at the major league level.
Yeah.
But it's like this guy might be 29, 30, 31 years old.
Right.
And so he spent like it's not somebody that we should necessarily be super, super excited for in terms of prospect status. So that's something else that kind of contributed to it. Because I know that whether it's talking about a guy like David Bodie or a guy like I know in last year we kind of had Mike Tauchman spent some time there. He was a different story because he performed well. But actually, honestly, Mike Tauchman is a pretty good example of this, right? Where Mike Tauchman put up a pretty decent, like a really decent slash line during his time in Iowa last year before he got called up. But his bash was still not outrageously impressive. Like his bash was still only 84, which is below average in terms of what he did. Now, obviously, he came up to the major leagues and he performed pretty well over the course of the season.
Right.
But are we setting expectations that Mike Tauchman is this like great player that's going to be a leadoff hitter for years to come in Chicago?
Right.
I don't think we should be. And I think Bash kind of shows why we shouldn't be that excited for Mike Tauchman.
As a Cub fan, a baseball fan, when you look in the eye test, right? You're watching it. Don't keep stats. Watch the game, watch him play, and your eyes tell a certain story. Do you find that Bash matches that most of the time? Does Bash back that eye test up?
Yeah, so that was super, super important to me because I get into the numbers quite a bit, but also like I watch a ton of minor league baseball. And so so much of following prospects is that like traditional scouting method, right? Like it's what is the guy like? Does the guy give off a vibe that he's going to be something good?
Yeah.
And so when I started creating this metric, I was running numbers on past Cubs prospects,
right,
and kind of showing what those numbers what the Bash looked like compared to past Cubs prospects to make sure it made sense, make sure it worked, and it all kind of matched up, it all lined up, and it made sense in my mind. And so now I've been running this metric for the past 2 years. Last year in 2023 was the first time I used it as the season wore on. 2022 was the first year I used it at all. And it's kind of matched up to this point. So I really like what I've seen in terms of what I've been watching on the field and the numbers that have been running in my spreadsheets in the background as I'm watching.
Right. See, I'm an old guy. I'm in my 60s. What you and I have just met. So to me, you look young. You could be 20 or 40. I can't tell. What is it?
Yeah. So I'm in my 20s. And yeah. So I think that I've spent the last decade watching prospects in minor league baseball. I've been doing it literally since I was like in high school, and I've been doing it ever since. And I've been podcasting and writing and doing all that stuff with Cubs prospects. And so I've kind of continued to evolve the way that I've been looking at prospects. Because early on, when I first started writing and doing stuff like that with prospects, I was not subscribed to even MILB TV, right? So I was following box scores. I was following, I would go on Baseball Reference and I would see what that final slash line looked like. And I'd be like, oh, like, well, the dude batted 300. He must be really good. And then it kind of evolved into watching just a ton of games and kind of what guys just gave off vibes that I liked. And then it evolved into kind of looking more at these advanced metrics, looking at the WRC plus, looking at swing strike rates, looking at stuff like that. And then I've been able to kind of merge all those things where like the final slash line does matter.
Yep.
The what I'm watching on the field does matter.
Mm-hmm.
The underlying metrics, they matter too. And kind of weighing them differently. Every year, I kind of weigh each of them differently as I'm kind of looking at prospects. And it depends, right? If a guy performs really bad, but hey, like he's kind of putting in the effort, he's kind of hidden into a lot of bad luck. I saw Jordan Wicks in 2022. Jordan Wicks got a lot of bad luck when he was pitching. And you wouldn't get that from just looking at the stat line.
Right.
He gave up a lot of broken bat singles, a lot of dribblers, a lot of like infield singles, stuff that like it was not his fault. His ERA would have been way lower. And watching him, you knew that was the case. You knew that whatever his ERA was at the end of the year probably should have been way lower.
Right.
But that's only what you get from watching those games. You wouldn't have got it by just stat line scouting,
Before I got like a ton of questions. Let me see your shirt. The Iowa's Tennessee. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I've got all 4 affiliates. Shout out to Obvious Shirts for sure. They've Obvious Shirts has filled out my wardrobe over the past couple of years. That's for sure.
Talking about the eye test, right, with stats, and there's
Mm-hmm.
so many stats now, right? Like when I first saw Bash, honestly, my first thought was, okay, another one, right?
Yeah.
Like when I'm doing a profile and I'm trying to put a piece together to kind of give everybody out there a chance to kind of see what it is. That's my struggle. How deep do I want to go?
Mm-hmm.
And again, at this age, when you're as old as I am, as you've seen as much baseball as I've seen in my lifetime, there's a test that I can tell you that for me works. It's how does the guy make me feel when he's at the plate?
Yeah.
I'm either confident or I'm not. I'm either like, okay, that all right, or a guy comes up, bases loaded, 2 outs, you're like, oh man, this right. And it's a feeling that comes from all of the data you've sort of digested.
Yeah.
So that I just find that baseball to me is, do I look for like Christopher Morel, must see TV for me. I would stand in my head to wait on Christopher Morel's next AB. Right.
Yeah.
Now I'm not sure if that's because I'm ultimately as confident about him as the entertainment value. So there's some stuff that mixes in with that.
But I think Morel is a really good example where you're looking at Christopher Morel and you're watching him on the field and you're like, what makes you like him besides the personality and the him playing so hard? Besides that, like you like him because he hits the ball super hard, he throws the ball super hard, and he runs super fast, right?
Yeah.
And so like the hope is that you take what you're watching and you're watching him hit the ball super hard, and then you integrate the numbers that say, his exit velocities are through the roof. His exit velocity numbers are tremendous.
Yeah.
And so when the eye test is telling you, yeah, he's hitting the ball hard, and the numbers are telling you, yeah, he's hitting the ball hard, then that's exactly what you're looking for. That's an ideal situation. I think that's how I look at the numbers in general, right? Where I'm looking at a good example this past year in 2023 was Jefferson Rojas, who spent the year down in low A Myrtle Beach. Super young guy. He was 18 years old, playing the entire season as an 18-year-old.
Yeah, he's 18 now, isn't he? Or is he 19?
Yeah. I think he might have just turned 19. He spent the entire year in 23 at 18 years old. He ended up putting together the highest bash in the system last year, minimum however many at bats, right?
Right.
He put up a bash of 135 last year. And as I was kind of following along, I was just watching him, and he does not look like an 18-year-old. He does not play like an 18-year-old. He looks like he knows what he's doing at the plate, and he was making solid contact. And so I was watching his bash as the season was wearing on. Obviously, you can't just look at it after 2 weeks and say, that's the all-knowing. That's everything. But I was kind of monitoring. I hope immediately high, and I was really glad by the end of the year that was true and that was the case.
I want to go back to the David Bodie situation. You mentioned him earlier. It surprised me when he got added to got the invite as a non-roster invitee, and it just makes you think, right? Anytime a move is made, it starts to flip over the rocks and you start to think, is the fact that we haven't signed PCA or Bellinger and Chapman, is David Bodie possibly that 1 year veteran guy instead of a multi-year contract guy? Or what would you think is the reason they went ahead and invited him?
Yeah, I think that my guess on why David Bodie got the non-roster invite to spring training is because he's been there and done that. I think
Yeah.
is what it comes down to. He's been around the organization for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times when you have, even on minor league deals at this point, David Bodie's on a major league deal. He's
Right.
off the 40-man roster. He's a super strange situation. I know you covered that on one of your older
Right.
other videos. He's such a strange situation, but typically when you have a guy that's in his 30s at this point, which David Bodie is, and he's on a minor league deal, he is going to get an invite to big league spring training. I don't think we
Right.
should look into it necessarily anything more than he's a veteran player, and he belongs, right? He belongs in that spring training camp.
Yeah.
And I think you look at the non-roster invitees, even for prospects, and like the expectation for those guys being invited to camp is like they will make the major leagues this season, even if
Mm-hmm.
it's not opening day. The ultimate goal is they're competing for a play for a roster spot come opening day. But like the
Mm-hmm.
idea is like even if it's not opening day, they'll make an impact in Chicago this year.
Mm-hmm.
With David Bodie, I think that he's such a strange situation that I could see anything from I think him starting on the major league roster opening day would be really shocking to me.
Okay.
But I think that we could see him make an impact in Chicago this year. I think he might get called up.
Mm-hmm.
I think that he might spend the entire year in AAA Iowa. I could also see
Mm.
him being cut before the
Right.
season rolls around. I could see
Yeah.
all three scenarios, and I wouldn't be surprised by any three of those. So
He is
um,
he's at an inflection point in his career,
he
right?
is. He
It's
is.
like he's at the fork in the road. What's going to happen is probably the final move, right?
Yeah, and I will say though, like he spent the entire year last year in AAA, and I've heard nothing but tremendous things about the type of teammate that David Bodie is,
Mm-hmm.
and the impact that he had on the younger players that were
Yeah.
at that level. I think that him taking them under his wing has been phenomenal. I think
Right.
that he has been willing to play multiple positions, as you said on your other video.
Yep.
Like he played a lot of shortstop this past
Mm-hmm.
year, which is pretty new. I mean, he hadn't played shortstop in that way since he was
Right.
like way,
Yep.
like a lot younger.
That's
And
true.
so him being able to take on the different roles and age pretty gracefully in terms of what he's doing in the clubhouse is just so important. So I think that if you ask the folks in Iowa, I think they
Mm-hmm.
would gladly take him back for the entire season just because of that impact that he has and more than just like that.
Um, I want to talk to you about your thoughts on the three prospects that we got for Baez, Riz, and KB, right? So it's
Mhm.
PCA, it's Alcantara, and it's Canario. And this is just, maybe there's not an answer, but did we win that trade? We can't answer that yet, right? Because none of those guys have played yet. Now we can also go, well, Baez have sort of fallen off, and KB's had a rough, but that they could bounce back, right?
Mhm.
So the idea of did we win that trade? Well, we don't know yet. My question to you is, in a scenario like that where we gave up the core of the championship team, and these are the three guys that we got in place of them, is it important to like management that these guys succeed as Cubs? Is there an element that they would be looked at as a different level of prospect because we gave up the franchise uh, for them? Had you considered that?
Yeah, I think because those guys were all fan favorites and they were all part of the World Series winning team. I think that if those guys, if Javi, KB, and Riz went to their new teams and were killing it, if they were all three performing at all-star caliber like levels,
Right,
I think we would be talking about the prospects that came back as like they must produce in a big way in
right,
Chicago. The
yeah,
fact that they haven't, the fact that they've all struggled in their own ways at their new organizations, I think that it all comes down to the fact that like those guys were fan favorites, regardless of what they're doing now with their new
right,
teams. They were fan favorites for this organization. Now, it seems like Jed Hoyer in the front office thinks they think and which is good. They think like they don't think with emotion in any way really. And I I'd rather have that. I'd rather have a front office not having emotion go into these major decisions. And so I'm thinking they don't look at Canario, at Casey, or at Kevin Alcantara in any
mhm,
more than they do any of their draft picks. When really you think about it, like
okay,
all these players, they paid for all these players in some way. Whether it was these guys in a trade, they gave up these players to get these prospects in return, or in the draft, they are drafting these guys and giving them signing bonuses, or international free agents, they are going out and paying these big signing bonuses for the IFA guys too. So
Right.
I think that especially the player development team, and I think a lot of the draft folks, I think they put a lot of stock into however a player is acquired. And I think it's important that they work out in some capacity. Now, honestly, we talk about the Alcantara, Owen Casey, and Alexander Canario, but like think about like that those weren't the only players coming back for
Right.
Riz, for KB and Javi, which is like it is basically down to those three, right?
Yeah, that's where we
Caleb
are.
Killian also came back for KB,
Mm-hmm.
and he's struggling. There was another pitcher that came back for Anthony Rizzo, and he is no longer in the
No.
organization. And then you have three other prospects that came back for Yu Darvish in the Owen Casey deal,
Mm-hmm.
and they're only one of the other guys is still left in the organization too, and he's
Right.
still in low A. So like those guys didn't work out, and now it's kind of on these three shoulders,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
It's gonna be interesting. What do you think about
Yeah.
PCA? Let's just. I'm not looking for you to, step out and put your abilities on the line here. Going to give PCA the keys to center field just right out of the gate this year and let's see what happens. Would you be ready to do that?
I think so. But I don't want to say for sure. It's gonna be so dependent on how he worked this offseason. And I know that he was down.
It's a big spring for him, right?
It is a big spring for him.
Yeah.
I'm just super curious to see. I know that like spring stats don't matter, and spring stats don't matter to a certain degree.
Right.
But I'm curious to see how he comes out this spring and looks based on the work that he did with Dustin Kelly down in Mesa during this offseason. That's gonna be so important because like we forget like he didn't spend much time in AAA last year. Like he was a pretty quick call up. Obviously we should not read anything into what he did at the major league level at the end of the year. It means zero what he did like in 14 at bats over the course of a month. It means nothing.
Yeah.
You know
what's fun? What's funny about it is when you talk about that, it's like we shouldn't read anything into it. I'm like, I've already seen him defensively. If you ask me the question, if we were going to DH for PCA, be like, hey, you want PCA in center field? Well, yeah, every inning from the start.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like, well, if he hits at all, and I was actually talking to my brother recently, and I was like, okay, a PCA to me is so good in center field that I'm willing to put up with, right? And I gave him the example of Ozzie Smith, right? Shortstop Ozzie Smith, no pop, but he's Ozzie Smith, right? It's like, well, not in center field. You need more than Ozzie Smith. But PCA does have that going for him that he's such. Can you imagine if he hits average and we've got Dansby and Nico and PCA up the middle with what we think? I don't know that I've ever seen a better middle than that.
Yeah, I mean he could absolutely be. Talking about advanced stats, like in terms of WAR, he could be a positive value player,
right?
Even if he struggles mightily with the bat this year,
like
because he's so good defensively in center field. Now, what it comes down to is the proper development of him long term, right? So, like if the Cubs feel like him struggling, and this is all entirely dependent on like the way the Cubs feel about him, the way they think he can handle it mentally struggling. If they think that he can handle struggling at the major league level mightily with the bat is nothing, like if that's fine, then like throw him up there, like he's ready to roll. If they think that it might mess with his psyche a little bit to struggle, then send him back down to AAA, make sure he's good to go. So when he comes up, like we don't have to do this same thing we saw with Ian Happ or Kyle Schwarber or all these other guys in past years where he's up and then he has to go back down. So PCA is incredible in center field. And I think in terms of value, he could play the entire year this year and he could struggle with the bat and still be a really good player. Yeah.
Let's do one more, Greg. I want your take on Cade Horton. Why the decision that was made? What do you think the plan is for Cade? Because during the convention, I think Carter said to expect Cade Horton's going to get some starts. Are they just to not put him in a pressure situation? Is it just to get him out of this and let him relax and take a month or two to develop and see what happens? What's your thoughts?
I've been thinking about this a lot over the past few weeks, and it's such an interesting situation with Cade. I've said all offseason that I think that we probably see Cade Horton in Chicago in, I'd say June-ish. I'd say he gets a handful of starts in the minor leagues and then comes up in June-ish in Chicago. The tricky thing with Cade Horton is that he's coming off of surgery not too long ago, just a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Last year he only logged so many innings. Well, it was
Right.
not quite 100 innings.
Mm-hmm.
And so typically you do not see the Cubs development staff build innings more than 40 at a time from year to year, right? So you're not going to get 150 innings from Cade Horton this year.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to get 130 innings from Cade Horton. I think 130 is probably his cap. So you got a 130 inning cap. You got a guy who is very close to being ready for Chicago, and you got a team that is ready to compete for the playoffs at the end of the year. And you want Cade Horton to be in that stretch run of the playoff run. So how do you limit those innings to make sure he's ready for that playoff run? That's so tough, man. Like it's so difficult. I think that I kind of referenced the Yuri Perez with the Marlins last year and how they
Mm-hmm.
handled him with kid
Mm-hmm.
gloves in terms of bringing him up to the major leagues, then shutting him down for a little bit, then bringing him back. Like it's just going to be super interesting how they handle Cade.
Yeah.
I was a little bit surprised that he wasn't part of the non-roster invite list
Yeah.
for spring training. But I want to clear up because I've seen a lot of people on social media worried that he's not in spring training. He's not in spring training.
Right. No, he's there.
He is there. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I keep reminding people, like, just because he's not on the big league roster in spring training doesn't
Right.
mean he's not there. He's still
Yeah.
getting work. I saw Rich Biesterfeld, who's great with pictures down in Arizona,
I
snap
saw
some
those too.
pictures. Yeah. So like I want to emphasize that he is in spring training. He's getting work
Yeah.
in.
I saw Ballesteros there too. So
Yes, exactly.
there's a bunch of them there.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting on how they limit those innings. Maybe they hold him back in extended spring training, and don't put him on an opening day roster coming out of spring. Maybe they just limit him to 3 innings at a time coming out the gate. Like it's going to be interesting. I would assume that he gets assigned his first stop, whenever that may be. Will be a few games in Double A Tennessee, then a few games in Triple A Iowa, and then the big leagues.
Great. Greg, listen, excellent job. Before we close out here, I want you to give the guys your best contact. I know you do a podcast, you got a website. Tell the guys how to get in touch with your stuff.
Yeah, so I am the host of the Cubs on Deck podcast, where we talk only about Cubs prospects. We spend our entire time talking about Cubs prospects. I host that along with Greg Zumak and Brian Smith. And then you can find that on any podcasting platform out there. We drop episodes over the off season. We've been every other week. Once the season starts up in March, we're going to be every week with that show. Excellent. All the podcasting platforms. You can find us on YouTube at the Northside Bound YouTube page, because that is also where I'm a co-founder of the website Northside Bound, where we write only about Cubs prospects. So Cubs prospects everywhere you look. You can find me on Twitter at Out of the Vines. You can find me on Instagram, Cubs on Deck. You can find me on Threads, Cubs on Deck, all that good stuff. So either look up Cubs on Deck. You can find me on Twitter, Out of the Vines, and Northside Bound. Those are the 3 names to know.
Well, awesome job, Greg. It was awesome meeting you. I love a good young Cub fan. All right. You're my guy. So I appreciate you coming on. Guys, I appreciate you checking us out. Be sure to check out Greg's website, his Twitter page, his podcast. Really good stuff. Very, very knowledgeable, and he's knowledgeable about things that we normally don't touch. He gets in deep, and he lives prospects, and I think that's unusual. So he's going to be, in my mind, he doesn't know this yet, but he's probably going to be a resource for me moving forward, because I tend to spend my time up in the broader spectrum. Guys, thanks for watching us. We'll see you very soon, and go Cubs go.